Somewhere over the hedgerows of Normandy, in the summer of 1944, a tiny fabric-covered airplane drifted through a sky full of war. It had no guns. It had no armor. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks or bullet-resistant glass. It weighed less than a small automobile. Its engine produced 65 horsepower, roughly the same as a modern riding lawnmower. The pilot, a young American artillery officer, sat in an open cockpit with nothing between him and the German army below, but a thin sheet of painted canvas and the wind in his face. He carried a radio, a map, a pair of binoculars, and a .45 caliber pistol on his hip. That was all. And yet, whenever this little airplane appeared over a German gun position, something remarkable happened. The guns fell silent. Entire batteries of heavy artillery, weapons that had been pounding American infantry for hours, simply stopped firing. Crews abandoned their pieces and dove for cover. Officers screamed orders to camouflage, to relocate, and to do anything to avoid being seen from above. Because the German gunners had learned, through terrible and repeated experience, exactly what that tiny airplane meant. Within minutes of being spotted, their position would be struck by a storm of high-explosive shells, so accurate and so overwhelming that nothing above ground would survive. This is the story of why German commanders kept losing their guns to American air-spotted fire. It is a story about a cheap civilian sport plane called the Piper Cub, about the artillery officers who flew it into combat, and about the revolutionary fire direction system that turned their aerial observations into instant destruction. It is a story about how one of the most overlooked innovations of World War II helped break the back of the Wehrmacht in the West. To understand how this system came to exist, you have to go back to the years before the war and to a bitter argument between two branches of the United States Army. Throughout the 1930s, the Army Air Corps, led by the ambitious Major General Henry Arnold, insisted that all military aviation belonged to the airmen. Every airplane, every pilot, every mission in the sky was their domain. This included the critical task of artillery spotting, the practice of using aircraft to observe enemy positions and direct cannon fire onto them. The Air Corps wanted fast, high-performance observation planes flown by their own trained aviators. They envisioned sleek monoplanes racing over the battlefield at altitude, radioing coordinates back to the guns below. But the field artillery officers saw the problem differently. They argued that a pilot flying at high speed and high altitude could not pick out the kind of targets an artillery battalion actually needed to hit. A camouflaged gun position tucked into a tree line, a mortar crew hidden behind a stone wall, a supply column moving through a narrow valley at dawn. These targets required someone who understood artillery, someone who could read the terrain the way a gunner reads it, and who could communicate with the fire direction center in the precise technical language of the cannoneers. A regular Air Corps pilot, no matter how skilled in the cockpit, simply did not have this training. He did not know the difference between a battery in defilade and a battery in the open, or why it mattered for selecting the right type of fuse. The solution came from an unlikely source. During the 1940 maneuvers in Louisiana, Texas National Guard officers, including First Lieutenant Joseph Watson, Jr., used their own privately owned Piper J-3 Cubs to direct artillery fire during field exercises at Camp Beauregard. The results were extraordinary. The little Cubs, flying low and slow over the exercise area, could see everything. Watson could circle over a target, radio corrections to the guns below, and watch the shells walk right onto the objective with devastating precision. It was a revelation that challenged everything the Air Corps had been claiming about who should fly artillery missions. The idea gained further momentum during the massive Army maneuvers of 1941 in Tennessee and Louisiana. 14 light aircraft, including 10 Pipers, 2 Aeroncas, and 2 Taylorcrafts, were provided free of charge by aircraft manufacturers for the exercises. Major General George Patton, himself a licensed pilot, was among the strongest advocates for the little spotter planes. The aircraft gave such an enormous advantage that the umpires were forced to ground them halfway through the maneuvers because they considered it unfair. Senior officers who witnessed the demonstrations came away convinced that the concept worked. The little plane had proven itself beyond any reasonable doubt. Major General Innis Swift, watching a J-3 bounce to a landing on unprepared desert at Fort Bliss, Texas, gave it the name that would stick. He called it a grasshopper. Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall personally overrode the Air Corps objections, and on June 6, 1942, exactly 2 years before D-Day, the War Department formally established organic light aviation within the field artillery. Each artillery battalion would receive 2 of these little planes, along with their own pilots and mechanics. The pilots would not be Air Corps men, they would be field artillery officers who happened to know how to fly. This distinction was critical. These were gunners first, pilots second. They thought like artillerymen because they were artillerymen. The aircraft they received was designated the L-4 Grasshopper. It was simply a militarized version of the Piper J-3 Cub, one of the most popular civilian sport planes in America. The specifications were almost comically modest for a military aircraft. It had a wingspan of 35 feet and 3 inches and a length of 22 feet and 5 inches. The entire airframe was built from welded steel tubing covered in fabric and doped canvas. Empty, it weighed approximately 680 pounds. Fully loaded with pilot, observer, radio and fuel, it came to about 1,200 pounds. The engine was a 65-horsepower Continental, a 65, the military designation being 0170-3, a 4-cylinder air-cooled flat engine. It cruised at 75 miles per hour, stalled at about 35, and could reach a service ceiling of roughly 11,000 feet. Its range was between 190 and 260 miles on a full tank. It could take off and clear a 50-foot obstacle in just 730 feet of ground roll. Any reasonably flat pasture, any stretch of country road, any farmer's field would serve as a runway. The military modifications were minimal. The plane received olive-drab paint, additional greenhouse windows cut into the upper rear fuselage to give the observer better downward and rearward visibility, and a portable radio, typically the SCR-610 or SCR-619, wired into the rear seat. That was the extent of the weaponry and the extent of the protection. No guns, no armor plate. Pilots flew with their service pistol, sometimes a parachute, and a Mae West life preserver. Nothing else stood between them and enemy fire except the fabric skin of the airplane and their own skill at evasive flying. Between 1941 and 1945, the military accepted over 5,400 L-4 variants. At peak production, the Piper factory was rolling out 1 aircraft every 20 minutes. Approximately 2,700 of them served with American field artillery units in the European theater alone. The training pipeline for these pilot officers was unlike anything else in the military. The Department of Air Training at the Field Artillery School, Fort Sill, Oklahoma, established in 1942, took artillery officers who already understood call for fire procedures and taught them how to fly. Most students already held a private pilot license or had at least 50 hours of flying time. Primary and basic flight training took place at Post Army Airfield adjoining Fort Sill. Advanced training in tactics, short field operations, soft field landings, and obstacle clearance was conducted at Denton, Texas. Graduates received the liaison pilot rating with its distinctive L-shielded pilot badge. The emphasis throughout was on practical battlefield skills, not aerobatics or formation flying. Landing in a 500-foot cow pasture with trees on both ends. Navigating at 100 feet above the ground in rain and fog. Taking off from a road with telephone wires on one side and a stone wall on the other. And above all, adjusting battalion fire from the air with speed and precision while the enemy shot at you from below. But the airplane and the pilot were only 2 pieces of a 3-part system. The third piece, and arguably the most important, was the fire direction center on the ground. This was the American innovation that no other army in the world could match. Developed at Fort Sill in the late 1930s by officers including Major Carlos Brewer and Major Orlando Ward, the Battalion Fire Direction Center was a mathematical brain that could compute firing data for a dozen guns in seconds using graphical firing tables. Every battery in a division and every attached core battery was tied together by a single common survey grid. This meant that any gun within range could fire on any target the air observer could see, without having to relay or re-register. A single observer in a cub could bring the weight of an entire corps artillery to bear on one point within minutes. The process worked like this. The pilot, an artillery officer himself, spotted a target from the air. He identified it visually and radioed map grid coordinates to the Fire Direction Center. The FDC, using firing tables corrected for wind speed, temperature, and barometric pressure, computed the firing data in seconds and transmitted it to the guns. The battery fired a single ranging round. The observer, circling above, watched where it landed and radioed corrections. Right 50, drop 100. The FDC adjusted and the battery fired for effect. The entire sequence, from first sighting to shells on target, could be completed in as little as 3 minutes. In Italy, one documented case saw a single Cub pilot direct 5 separate corps-level fire missions inside a single hour. But the real power of the system emerged when multiple battalions were brought to bear simultaneously. Because every unit shared the same survey grid, the FDC could coordinate what was called a time-on-target mission. In a time-on-target mission, every battery within range calculated the flight time of its shells to the target and timed the pull of its lanyards, so that every first round from every gun arrived within approximately 3 seconds of each other. There was no warning, no ranging round to send the enemy diving for cover, just a sudden, simultaneous avalanche of steel and high explosive that obliterated everything in the target area before anyone could react. The Germans had no equivalent capability. No German artillery system could produce a time-on-target mission. Brigadier General William Wallace Ford, one of the founding figures of Army aviation and former head of the Department of Air Training, described witnessing a time-on-target mission in his memoir. He called it murderous. He said it was devastating and shattering to observe, and he was glad he never had to endure one from the receiving end. The Grasshopper's combat debut came during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, in November of 1942. On November 9th, 3 L-4s were flown off the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Ranger off the coast of Casablanca, Morocco. Their mission was to direct naval gunfire and scout for the Western Task Force. The debut was not smooth. Several of the Cubs were fired upon by American Navy ships, whose crews had not been informed to expect tiny fabric-covered airplanes in the combat zone. Captain Durgin aboard the Ranger had not broken radio silence to warn the surface fleet of their arrival. At least one Cub was forced down by friendly fire. The episode was later the subject of a stinging post-war analysis. But the lessons were absorbed quickly, and the mistakes of the first day were never repeated. By the spring of 1943, air observation post detachments were operating in Tunisia in support of the 1st, 9th, and 34th Infantry Divisions and the 1st Armoured Division. During the fighting around Kasserine Pass in February 1943 and the subsequent Allied recovery at El Gheta in March, the Cubs were spotting for multiple field artillery battalions across the American sector. The results immediately attracted attention at the highest levels of the enemy command. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, writing to his wife during the fighting around Kasserine in February 1943, complained that an observation plane had directed the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets throughout the zone. That single sentence, written by one of Germany's most celebrated commanders, captures the essence of the problem the Wehrmacht would face for the rest of the war. They could not hide from the eyes in the sky. The system matured rapidly through Sicily and Italy. In Sicily, during Operation Husky in July 1943, L-4s flew from the decks of landing ships whose flat surfaces were converted into improvised flight decks. It was in Sicily that the air observation posts won full recognition as a dependable agency for directing field artillery fire. The Cubs supported the 1st, 3rd, 9th, and 45th Infantry Divisions and the 2nd Armoured Division of Patton's 7th Army, helping break up the Hermann Goering Division's armoured counterattack at Gela on July 11, 1943. Air observers spotted the advancing German tanks and called artillery onto them before they could reach the beaches. The counterattack, which might have driven the invasion into the sea, was shattered. In Italy, the system reached a new level of sophistication and lethality. At Salerno in September 1943, and throughout the long, brutal campaign up the Italian peninsula, the air observation posts became, in the words of contemporary reports, extremely popular with the American infantry and highly unpopular with the Germans. It was in Italy that the technique of flak suppression patrols was perfected. L-4s would trail medium bomber missions, watch for the muzzle flashes of German anti-aircraft guns firing at the bombers, and then call artillery down onto those very guns. The hunters became the hunted. A flak crew that fired at a formation of B-25s might find itself under a barrage of 105mm shells 3 minutes later, targeted by a Cub they never even noticed circling above them. At Anzio, the air observation posts faced their most grueling test. From January to May of 1944, the American 6th Corps was confined to a beachhead just 7 miles deep and 15 miles wide. Every square yard was under German observation from the Alban Hills rising above the flat coastal plain. The Germans employed their heaviest weapons, including 2 massive K5 railway guns that the Germans themselves had named Robert and Leopold. The Allied soldiers on the beachhead, who initially believed they were being shelled by a single weapon, gave the guns their own nickname, calling them Anzio Annie. These enormous weapons, firing 280mm shells from positions behind the Alban Hills, tormented the beachhead day and night. American counter-battery fire, much of it directed by L-4 spotters circling over the beachhead, became the principal defense against the relentless German bombardment. The Germans fought back with elaborate deception. They built dummy gun positions from telephone poles with synchronized flash simulators designed to draw American fire away from the real batteries. They hid their railway guns in tunnels cut into the hillsides, rolling them out only to fire a few rounds before pushing them back into cover. Even so, Allied reconnaissance and cub spotters located many of the hidden batteries, including heavy guns on the slopes above Lake Nemi. The cub pilots learned over time to distinguish the fakes from the real weapons by watching for the subtle differences in smoke pattern and recoil signature that no dummy could perfectly replicate. During Operation Diadem in May 1944, the Allied assault that finally broke the Gustav Line at Cassino, 1,600 Allied guns supported the attack. American heavy battalions armed with 240mm and 8-inch howitzers, working with air-observed fire, destroyed key German fortifications and bridges along the line of advance. The standard American infantry division in Italy fielded 3 battalions of 12 105mm howitzers, each for direct support, with 155mm howitzers in general support, and the devastating 155mm long tom guns and 8-inch howitzers at corps level. Every one of these weapons could be called onto a single target by an observer in a cub. The weight of metal that the American artillery brought to bear in Italy was staggering, and the eyes that guided it were the pilots in their grasshoppers. But it was in Normandy that the full devastating potential of the system was unleashed on a scale never seen before. For the invasion of France, Major Delbert Bristol of 1st Army planned the air observation post deployment. The Navy had declined his proposal to use an escort carrier as a floating cub base off the Normandy coast, so Bristol had to improvise. Most aircraft were disassembled, loaded onto trucks, shipped across the English Channel on transport vessels, and reassembled on the Norman beaches by their own mechanics. Others flew across the Channel directly, with the L-4s carrying an improvised auxiliary fuel tank fashioned from an oxygen bottle and plumbed into the fuel system in the rear seat. It was a dangerous crossing over waters crowded with so many ships that one pilot later joked he could never have hit the water even if his engine had quit. On D-Day itself, artillery aviation officers of the 4th Infantry Division confirmed that a pre-selected airstrip near St. Martin de Varaville behind Utah Beach was usable, and the division's planes were brought across from England. Among the first artillery fire, missions registered ashore on the European continent on D-Day were those directed from the air behind Utah Beach. The 29th Infantry Division's Artillery Aviation Section, which its members proudly called the 29th Air Force, arrived behind Omaha Beach. Within days, the American Army had hundreds of towed and self-propelled artillery pieces ashore in Normandy, and the Cubs were already circling above them, giving the gunners eyes that could see for miles in every direction. In the bocage country of June and July 1944, the L-4 proved utterly irreplaceable. The Norman hedgerows, ancient earthen walls topped with dense tangles of vegetation, some of them centuries old, reduced ground observation to just a few hundred yards in any direction. An artillery forward observer standing on the ground behind a hedgerow could see almost nothing of the enemy. But the cub pilot, circling 1,000 feet above, could see over all of the hedgerows, spot the German positions hidden among them, identify gun emplacements and supply routes and troop concentrations, and bring the full weight of American artillery crashing down with devastating accuracy. The Cubs became, in the words of one contemporary report, the only effective means available to the artillery for locating targets and adjusting fire during the hedgerow fighting. The cost of this work was severe. First Army air observation posts lost 59 aircraft and 42 pilots killed between June and August of 1944 alone. More than half of their total wartime losses compressed into just 3 months of intense fighting. The hedgerow country was a killing ground for the slow, low-flying Cubs. German machine gunners hidden behind the hedgerows, riflemen in church towers, and dedicated flak crews assigned specifically to shoot down the spotter planes all took a deadly toll. In one representative tragedy, an L-4 pilot and his observer from the 90th Infantry Division were both killed when their aircraft, flying on the American side of the line, was struck by friendly American field artillery fire passing through its altitude band. The observation pilots lived exactly like the infantry, in foxholes, unwashed, unshaved, and fed on K rations. They flew from dawn to dusk every day the weather allowed, pitting their fragile airplanes against everything the Germans could throw at them, then crawled back into their foxholes at night. Their improvised airstrips were often nothing more than a cleared section of farm field or a straight stretch of country lane. Ground crews kept the Cubs flying with whatever tools and spare parts they could scrounge. When an aircraft was damaged beyond repair, the mechanics stripped it for usable parts, and the pilot waited for a replacement to be flown up from the rear. There were no hangars, no control towers, and no paved runways. Just a field, a windsock, and a war. At Mortain in August 1944, the system proved itself in the most dramatic possible fashion. 3 companies of the 30th Infantry Division, surrounded on Hill 317 by the massive German Operation Luetich counterattack, were kept alive in significant part by 12.5 artillery battalions, whose fires were directed largely by air observers from surrounding division and corps aviation sections. The artillery placed solid walls of high-explosive shells in front of American defensive positions, breaking up wave after wave of German armor and infantry assaults that tried to overrun the hilltop. Without the eyes in the sky directing those fires with precision, the men on Hill 317 would almost certainly have been overwhelmed. The 4th Armored Division of Patton's Third Army made particularly aggressive use of the Cubs after the breakout from the bocage. Column commanders would land next to a waiting L-4 along a roadside, hop in, and fly ahead to personally scout the route of advance with their own eyes before committing their troops. It was with the 4th Armored Division that the most spectacular individual exploit of the entire air observation post story took place. Major Charles Carpenter, a high school history teacher from Illinois before the war, had grown frustrated with merely observing. He wanted to fight directly. So he mounted 6 bazooka rocket launcher tubes, 3 on each wing strut, onto his L-4. He called the aircraft Rosie the Rocketer. His fellow officers thought he was out of his mind. The bazookas weighed down the already sluggish Cub, and the recoil from firing them threatened to shake the flimsy airframe apart in mid-flight. But Carpenter was undeterred. He tested his improvised weapon system at every opportunity, diving on targets, firing rockets, and flying back to reload. At the Battle of Aracourt in September 1944, when elements of the 5th Panzer Army launched a major armoured counterattack against the 4th Armoured Division, Carpenter flew directly into the fight. On September 20th, 1944, when the fog lifted around noon, Carpenter spotted a company of Panther tanks and armoured cars advancing on the headquarters of Combat Command A. Diving through a storm of German ground fire, he fired all 6 of his rockets at the enemy column. Then he flew back to his improvised airstrip, reloaded the tubes, and went back out over the battlefield. He flew 2 more attack sorties that afternoon, firing at least 16 bazooka rockets in total. He immobilized 2 German tanks and several armored cars, and killed a number of enemy soldiers. By the end of the war, Carpenter was credited with destroying or disabling 6 enemy tanks and several armored cars. Carpenter told a Stars and Stripes correspondent that word must be getting around among the Germans to watch out for Cubs with bazookas on them. Every time he showed up now, they shot at him with everything they had. They never used to bother Cubs before, he said. Carpenter was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, and the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster for his actions. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, weather initially grounded the observation aircraft during the critical opening week of the German Ardennes offensive. Fog, snow, and low clouds kept the Cubs on the ground precisely when they were needed most. But on the northern shoulder of the Bulge, 4 American infantry divisions, the 1st, 2nd, 9th, and 99th were supported by hundreds of artillery pieces massed by corps and division artillery. During the desperate defense of Dom-Butenbach by the 26th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, American artillery, much of it air-observed when breaks in the clouds permitted, fired more than 10,000 rounds in an 8-hour period. The barrage halted the armoured spearheads of the 12th SS Panzer Division and broke up one assault after another. When the skies finally cleared after December 23rd, the air observation posts returned in force across the entire Ardennes front. Their effectiveness was magnified further by a new weapon released for ground use just days before, the proximity fuse, also known as the variable time fuse. This fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter that detonated the shell in the air just above the ground, showering everything below with lethal fragments. No foxhole offered protection. No trench was deep enough. Combined with the pinpoint accuracy of air-spotted fire, the proximity fuse was devastating against troops in the open. When the Rhine River defences collapsed in March of 1945, the air observation posts had, in the words of one summary, several field days firing on the artillery batteries that were trying to protect the German retreat to the east bank. These batteries were destroyed or silenced one by one as the Cubs circled above and called in devastating concentrations. For 9th Army's Rhine crossing at Wesel on March 23rd and 24th, more than 2,000 American guns opened fire in support. Many of the missions were directed from the air by observation pilots who guided the fire of entire battalions from their circling Cubs. The bombardment put more than 65,000 rounds onto the eastern bank at a peak rate of roughly 1,000 rounds per minute. It was one of the greatest concentrations of artillery fire in the history of warfare. The final aerial encounter of the L-4's war was perhaps its most improbable. On April 11th, 1945, near Dannenberg, Germany, First Lieutenant Duane Francies and his observer Lieutenant William Martin of the 71st Armoured Field Artillery Battalion, 5th Armoured Division, were flying their 142nd combat mission in their L-4 named Miss Me. They spotted a German Fieseler Storch, the Luftwaffe's own observation aircraft, flying at about 700 feet. Francies radioed his base with the message, "We are about to give combat." Then he dove toward the Storch. The two observation planes, neither one armed with anything more than the sidearms of their crews, closed to within 30 feet of each other. Francies and Martin opened fire with their .45 caliber pistols through the open windows of the Cub. They hit the Storch's windshield and punctured a fuel tank. The German aircraft spun and crashed into the ground below. Both German crewmen survived the crash. Martin climbed out of his Cub and bandaged the German observer's wounded foot. Francies was twice recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross during the war, but received no decoration until the journalist Cornelius Ryan drew attention to the case in his 1966 book about the fall of Berlin. Senator Henry Jackson pressed for action, and Francies finally received his Distinguished Flying Cross at Holman Field, St. Paul, Minnesota, on March 13, 1967, 22 years after the encounter. So why could the Germans not stop this system? Why did their commanders keep losing their guns, month after month, campaign after campaign, from North Africa to the banks of the Elbe? The answer lies in 4 fundamental problems that the Wehrmacht was never able to solve. The first was doctrinal rigidity. German field artillery doctrine was built around massed, pre-registered concentrations fired from carefully surveyed positions. Batteries spent days selecting and preparing their firing sites, registering on known targets, and building up camouflaged emplacements. The entire system depended on concealment. A single Cub overhead destroyed that foundation in an instant. The moment a German battery opened fire, its muzzle flash and smoke gave away its position to the observer circling above. Weeks of careful camouflage work became worthless with a single salvo. The second problem was slow tactical communications. German fire direction procedures required careful pre-plotting by surveyors and lengthy calculations before guns could engage a new target. Improvised, instantaneous massing of fires from multiple batteries onto a single point was beyond their procedural capacity. Where an American air observation post could call in a corps-level concentration in 3 to 9 minutes, the equivalent German response took 20 minutes or more. By that time, the American guns had already ceased firing, and the observer had moved on to find the next target. The third problem was mobility. German artillery in 1944 and 45 remained largely horse-drawn. When a battery was spotted from the air and had to relocate, it moved at the speed of horses and human muscle. Guns had to be limbered, horses hitched, ammunition loaded onto caissons, and the entire battery dragged down narrow roads to a new position. The American observers in their cubs simply followed, watching from above as the battery struggled to move. By the time the Germans reached a new site and began setting up, the cub was already overhead, ready to call in another fire mission. The fourth, and perhaps most decisive problem, was air superiority. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe had lost control of the skies over its own front lines in the west. The Germans possessed an excellent observation aircraft of their own, the Fieseler Storch, but they could not fly it over American positions in daylight without it being shot down almost immediately. Meanwhile, the Americans could fly their cubs over German positions with relative freedom. German anti-aircraft crews learned that firing at a cub was often a death sentence. The muzzle flash of an 88mm flak gun was enormous and visible for miles from the air. The moment a flak crew opened fire on a cub, the pilot radioed the coordinates of the gun, and within minutes a time-on-target barrage would obliterate the position. Hughes Rudd, an air observation post pilot with the 93rd Field Artillery Battalion, recalled flying near Bitche in the Vosges Mountains when a German 88 fired a ladder of 6 rounds at him. He could see the muzzle flashes clearly from his cockpit. He radioed the coordinates to his fire direction center, and they poured 36 rounds into the gun position. There were no more ladders from that quarter, he recalled. German attempts to actively hunt the cubs with fighter aircraft proved nearly futile. The cubs' stall speed of 35 miles per hour created an almost absurd tactical problem for any German fighter pilot. A Messerschmitt 109, traveling at more than 300 miles per hour, could not slow down enough to keep the tiny cub in its gun sights without stalling its own engine and spinning into the ground. The speed differential was simply too extreme. Standard L-4 evasive doctrine exploited this ruthlessly. When a fighter approached, the cub pilot dove to treetop height and flew tight turns around obstacles. Barns, church steeples, tree lines, anything that a high-performance fighter could not follow through without ripping off a wing. The cub could turn inside any fighter ever built, simply because it flew so slowly. What would have been a fatal weakness in conventional air combat became an almost perfect defense through the simple physics of speed and turning radius. Even dedicated anti-aircraft weapons proved unreliable against the cubs. The 20mm rapid-fire cannon could track the slow-moving target easily enough, but its tracers gave away the gun position instantly to the observer above. And a 20mm flak gun, once spotted, was a soft target for an entire battalion's worth of 105mm shells. The heavier 88mm guns were designed to shoot down bombers flying at high altitude in predictable straight lines. Against a cub weaving through the treetops at 70 miles per hour, changing altitude by hundreds of feet in seconds, the 88s were almost useless. The cumulative psychological effect of this system was as devastating as the physical destruction it caused. German gun crews developed a conditioned fear of the little planes. Entire batteries that had been firing aggressively went silent the instant a cub appeared overhead. Crews who had been serving their guns with discipline and determination simply refused to fire. The observation aircraft imposed an invisible ceiling of suppression across entire sectors of the front, reducing German artillery output even when no shells were actually falling. After Operation Cobra in late July 1944, the massive breakout from the Norman hedgerows, General Fritz Bayerlein of the elite Panzer Lehr Division described the devastation. He said his front lines looked like a landscape on the moon, and that the majority of his forward troops were out of action. While the initial saturation bombing did the greatest damage, the follow-on artillery, much of it directed by air observation post pilots circling above the shattered German positions, finished what the bombers had begun. The Germans were not the only nation to use aerial observation for artillery. The British had actually formalized the concept before the Americans did. Major Charles Bazley of the Royal Artillery established the first dedicated air observation post unit at Old Sarum on February 1, 1940, and deployed briefly to France before the German Blitzkrieg ended the campaign. The first operational British squadron, No. 651 Squadron RAF, formed in August 1941 and deployed to Algeria in November 1942, just 4 days after the Torch landings. The British used the Taylorcraft Auster, a slightly heavier aircraft whose later marks carried engines of up to 130 horsepower, and crucially, their pilots were all Royal Artillery officers, not RAF aviators, just as the American pilots were artillerymen rather than Air Corps men. By the Normandy campaign, 7 air observation post squadrons supported British and Canadian forces, each generally assigned to a corps. The British system was tactically effective and shared some of the American-influenced fire planning methods, but it lacked the rapid, decentralized mass fire capability of the American battalion-level fire direction center. British counter-battery work was organized centrally at the Army Group Royal Artillery level, which made it less immediately responsive to fleeting targets of opportunity spotted from the air. The Soviets used their own observation aircraft, including the famous Polikarpov Po-2 biplane, but Soviet artillery doctrine was fundamentally different. The Red Army relied on massive pre-planned barrages coordinated at the highest levels of command rather than responsive, decentralized fire adjustment at the battalion level. Soviet artillery was the most numerous in the world. They called it the God of War, but it was an instrument of planned destruction, not of improvised precision. The Germans themselves relied on the Storch and the Henschel 126 for aerial observation, but these aircraft were controlled by the Luftwaffe rather than by the Army's own artillery officers. The pilot in a Storch did not speak the language of the gunner. He could not read the battlefield the way an artilleryman reads it, and there was no German equivalent of the fire direction center to translate what he saw into instant coordinated fire from dozens of guns. The American advantage was not any single piece of technology. It was the entire system working in concert. 5 elements came together to produce an effect that no opponent could match. First, ownership. The pilot worked for the artillery, not for a separate air service. He understood gunnery procedures and spoke fire direction language with the fluency of a native. Second, decentralization. Every single battalion had its own airplanes. No one needed to request support up a separate chain of command. Third, the mathematics at the fire direction center. Graphical firing tables and pre-surveyed grids made it possible to mass fires from multiple batteries onto a single point within seconds of the call. Fourth, industrial mass. The Cub was cheap to build, simple to maintain, and produced by the thousands. Pilot training was rapid and practical. Fifth, air supremacy. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe simply could not contest the airspace over the front at low altitude. The statistics tell a stark and unambiguous story. Approximately 2,700 Leiter-4s served with American field artillery in the European theater. Nearly 900 were lost to enemy action and accidents, roughly 1 in 3 of the total deployed. First Army air observation posts alone lost 176 aircraft and 81 pilots from June 1944 to May 1945. Air observation posts directed better than 75% of all observed American artillery adjustments across the entire European campaign. The men who flew these missions were not fighter aces or bomber heroes. They were artillery officers sitting in canvas, covered airplanes with 65 horsepower engines, doing the most dangerous flying of the war at the lowest altitudes and the slowest speeds. With absolutely no protection and no weapons beyond a pistol in a holster, many of them did not survive. Those who did rarely received the recognition given to the pilots of faster and more celebrated aircraft. General George Patton, reflecting on the campaigns that carried his Third Army from Normandy to the heart of Germany, told his artillerymen that he did not have to tell them who won the war, because they knew the artillery did. General Raymond Barton of the 4th Infantry Division regarded the artillery as his most powerful asset, noting that often it was his only reserve. Both men understood what stood behind those guns. They understood that behind every devastating barrage, behind every time-on-target mission that shattered a German counterattack, behind every concentration that silenced an enemy battery, there was a quiet professional in a fragile airplane, circling patiently above the battlefield, watching and reporting and adjusting fire until the job was done or he was shot out of the sky. The German Wehrmacht fielded superb artillery throughout the war. Their weapons were the equal of anything the Allies possessed. The 105mm light field howitzer 18, the 150mm heavy field howitzer 18, and the legendary 88mm gun were all excellent pieces of ordnance, served by well-trained and courageous crews. What the Germans lacked was the system that surrounded the American guns. A spotter plane in every battalion, a fire direction center that computed data in seconds, a common grid tying every battery together, the time-on-target technique that turned the first round into the killing round, the proximity fuse that made every shell lethal in the air above the target, effectively unlimited ammunition flowing from the factories of a continental industrial power, and total air supremacy over the battlefield that allowed those tiny, slow, unarmed airplanes to fly with impunity while the enemy's own observation aircraft sat uselessly on the ground. When all of these elements worked together, and from late 1943 onward they almost always did, German commanders found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. If their batteries fired, they were spotted. If they were spotted, they were destroyed. If they did not fire, their infantry was left without artillery support against an enemy whose own guns never stopped. That was the trap the Grasshopper and the Fire Direction Center built together, and no German commander, no matter how brilliant or experienced, ever found a way out of it. From the deserts of Tunisia to the mountains of Italy, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes and the plains of Germany, the story repeated itself in campaign after campaign. German batteries set up with care and discipline, camouflaged their guns with nets and foliage, registered on their targets, and prepared to fight. Then a cub appeared overhead, circling patiently against the clouds, and within minutes the shells began to fall. The 65-horsepower Piper Cub, the cheapest and most fragile aircraft in the entire American arsenal, became the single most dangerous thing in the sky for a German artilleryman. Not because of what it carried, which was essentially nothing at all, but because of what it could see from above and what it could summon from the guns below. That is why German commanders kept losing their artillery, not to a wonder weapon, not to a secret technology, but to a system built from ordinary components that together produced extraordinary results, a humble little airplane connected by radio to a mathematical brain on the ground and the finest massed artillery in the world, all working together in a seamless partnership that no enemy ever found a way to defeat.